I spent several years planning and preparing for my dream bike tour through South America, and earlier this year, I finally tried. I wanted to spend 6 to 9 months traveling, and because of this and timelines for other life goals and plans, I needed to start as early as possible this year, or likely wouldn't have another chance to go. Unfortunately, conflicting obligations meant I couldn't start until mid-April, which is already fall in the Southern Hemisphere and not the ideal time to start my planned route. I was confident weather would be manageable though, but I did recognize it may impact timelines and route decisions. So after crossing everything off my pre-trip to-do list and saying all my goodbyes, I packed my bicycle and all my gear and got on a plane to Ushuaia, Argentina, the farthest south city anywhere in the world and the farthest I've ever been away from home. Ushuaia isn't quite the end of the road though, so, and partly as a gear check, I had my sights on the actual Fin del Mundo, the end of the route to trace. It wasn't far from where I was staying, so after assembling my bike, I packed only what I'd need for the day and began pedaling. Both the weather and the route were incredible, and I was in awe by how different everything was from spring in Southern California. And I thought it was so cool to finally see the famous sign in person. Unfortunately, the weather forecast for the next several days in and around Ushuaia was less than ideal. And although I wasn't particularly keen on suffering through the wind, rain, and cold, I was eager to get started heading north before winter fully set and locked me in. My overall route plan was more or less to cut through Tierra del Fuego to follow the Argentine Andes up to El Chalten, and then to take the ferry across to the southern terminus of the Carretera Austral, and then to follow the Carretera Austral through Chile and up to Santiago, where my partner was to meet me in 2 months for her vacation. This would require an average of about 35 miles per day with just 1 rest day per week, so it was also motivation to just get started. Afterwards, the plan was to cross back into Argentina, go north through Salta and into Bolivia to pass through the Uyuni salt flats, then around Lake Titicaca, and then through the Peru Divide, the Trans-Ecuador, through the mountains of Colombia, and down into Cartagena, where I plan to end my tour. Distances like that are overwhelming to me though, so I set my focus in the next few days. And for day 1, my goal was to make it to a restaurant about 30 miles away for lunch, and then to a town another 30 miles away to sleep indoors and out of the rain and strong winds. So after buying a few days of food and charging all my equipment and camera gear, I started my tour a couple hours before sunrise. True to the forecast, it rained non-stop, and as I was climbing the hill outside of town, the rain turned to ice rain and then to snow. Visibility was bad, the road was slippery, and even though I wore only 1 layer under my rain gear, I still managed to sweat through and was wet from the inside. After a long downhill to the restaurant, I was chilled to the bone and had no desire to carry on for the day. I asked about camping, but lucky for me, they offered to let me sleep on the dining room floor next to a wood-burning stove after they closed for the night. In talking to the employees and customers, I learned that the weather was exceptional, even for the season, and the wind was so strong they were concerned about their windows shattering. I also learned that north of Rio Gallegos, the weather warms and improves quite a bit, so after only 1 day, I had already updated my route to pass through there before making my way west towards the Andes. The next day, the weather was better, and although there were strong winds, they were tailwinds. I was feeling renewed and excited for the trip ahead, when only a few miles into the day, I had a blowout where my rear tire met the rim bead. Upon closer inspection, I realized the rim on my brand new bicycle was already damaged. There was a flat spot on the rim bead that created a sharp edge that had cut a 2-inch slash into my tire. I sanded the sharp edge as best I could with the sandpaper from an inner tube patch kit, installed my spare tire, and continued along. I enjoyed amazing views of forests, valleys, and rivers cutting through the landscape. The weather generally held very well, but I was learning a thing or two about wind. I knew Patagonia was famous for its wind, but until experiencing it firsthand, I'm not sure I really understood how much an impact it could have. I eventually made my way to a motorcycle tourist hostel in Rio Grande with an on-site microbrewery and an excellent restaurant, not to mention being located on the beach with views from the room straight to the Atlantic. Continuing from there were many more interesting sights and experiences. What seemed like every few minutes I'd see guanacos grazing and then running away as fast as possible once they noticed me. I found myself in the middle of multiple sheep drives. One even passed on the main highway and held up the few cars that were passing through, while others were off to the side on well-worn paths. A few days later, I flatted on my front tire and I learned that both my rims were damaged in the same way and in the same relative spots. Luckily, the impact was much less severe on the front tire, so I was able to carry on just by installing an inner tube after sanding the sharp spot. I also really love the refugios that were built to provide wind protection for cyclists passing through, and were also excellent places to cook lunch. I enjoyed many more views of the ocean, the valleys, and the hills, including from one of the ferries that connects the Tierra del Fuego province to the Santa Cruz province. Eventually I arrived in Rio Gallegos, but about 2 blocks from my lodging, my rear tire blew out in the same spot as before. I wasn't too worried because I knew the city of over 100,000 residents had a few bike shops, but it turned out that none carried replacement tires that were compatible with my rims. I therefore had to make do, which meant trying to minimize the damage my rims could inflict on my tires and repairing the tires as best I could. I started with some additional sanding on the sharp edges of the rims, trying to make the rough spots as smooth as possible. And I also decided to cover the sanded areas with duct tape, even though I was initially concerned this would interfere with the bead. I also sewed the tire blowouts with dental floss, taking special care to sew through the bead to minimize the contact areas of the floss with the rim. And I covered my stitches with duct tape to further protect them. And when I installed the tires again, I made sure to offset the stitches from the damaged spots on the rim. I knew this was at best a temporary solution, so began looking at the map again, this time with both an eye on weather and on the most likely place I could buy replacement tires. I had thrown out my plan to head towards the Andes, the truly famous and breathtaking part of Patagonia, in part because of snow and headwinds, and in part because I was not confident that my tires would be able to endure the gravel roads that dominate that part of Patagonia. So I set my sights on Comodoro Rivadavia, the next big city, and another great opportunity to head west. Things were going well, but a surprise rainstorm with winds over 50 miles per hour rolled in, and I found myself struggling to stay out of oncoming traffic and questioning all of the life decisions that had led me to this particular desolate road when a semi-truck pulled over in front of me. I hadn't planned on asking for help, but the driver and his brothers seemed genuine and friendly, and I couldn't turn down their offer to give me a ride into town. My Spanish isn't perfect, but I am fluent, and I really enjoyed talking to them, so when we arrived at the next town, and they insisted I continue to the next one, I didn't think much of it. I did start to feel a little weird when they didn't want to stop there and insisted I continue to a third town, and when they didn't give me an opportunity to exit then, I started to feel like I needed to figure out how to convince them to let me go. The tone of the conversation had changed drastically, and I was very uncomfortable with the situation. Eventually, they started arguing in Portuguese, which I don't understand, and after an awkward silence between them, the tone changed, but this time for the better, and they agreed to let me exit at the next big town, and they actually did. I don't know if I was close to something bad happening, but I was relieved. I rode into Comodoro Rivadavia excited to finally put my tire issues behind me and ready for a couple of rest days. The ride in was one of the best of the trip to date and even included long stretches on the old decommissioned road or the new road that was still in construction. The weather was incredible too, so I was hopeful I had mostly escaped winter. My optimism was shaken though when, after visiting all the bike shops in town, I found out they also don't carry tires compatible with my rims. There was also a major storm rolling in from the west with 60-mile-per-hour winds and enough snow to close most roads. Basically the worst possible forecast for when I planned to cut west to the Andes. And without new tires, I was not confident my sewing would hold up against the gravel roads that dominated my planned route. So I decided to reroute again, and this time through Bahia Blanca, one of the largest cities in the country. Within a few days after departing, I realized the scenery wasn't going to change, and I effectively lost all interest in filming. In every direction and almost all day, the horizon would bend with the only thing in sight being low bushes and the occasional cows, sheep, or guanacos. Further, there was really only one route north, which was also the busiest trucking route in the country, and the shoulder eventually all but disappeared. After a particularly scary section of busy highway, I was desperate for an alternative and saw a side road on the map. It was great at first, but eventually faded to double track, and then to single track, and then to no track. I wanted so bad to believe the road would open back up again that I didn't notice all the plants had thorns on them, at least not until after double flatting, which I thought was funny until I spent 4 hours backtracking 4 miles because I had to keep stopping to patch additional punctures or add air to my tires. All told, I ended up repairing over 20 punctures that day and still couldn't find a couple of slow leaks. And unfortunately in Bahia Blanca, I was still unable to find replacement tires or spare tubes despite going to every bike shop in town. The best I could do was buy slime for my last couple of inner tubes and more duct tape and dental floss for my tires. I had already been considering routing to Buenos Aires and then flying to meet my partner in Santiago and then routing north from there. And my only hesitation at this point was that everyone I talked to was warning me I'd be stabbed and robbed upon entering the city. One of my favorite warnings came from a sock salesman who approached me outside a gas station. He was really insistent that I take a certain route and that his friend would help me find a ride into the city. As what I assume he meant to be a gesture of good faith, he even gave me a pair of the best cycling socks in all of Argentina. Needless to say, I didn't accept his or his friend's help. My tire issues were also getting worse. For the last couple of weeks headed into Buenos Aires, I had spent almost every evening sewing new spots of my tires that were threatening to blow out. The stress about keeping air in my tires was a huge detractor from my trip, and I was especially nervous about having issues so more unsafe. But I was determined to finish this section of the trip, even if it meant pushing my bike or being robbed. As long as there wasn't a stabbing involved, I assumed I would be able to figure something out. It wasn't all bad though. There were many moments of joy along the way, and I met some amazing people. The day of all the punctures, a trucker helped me to find a place to sleep indoors to get my bicycle back in order. And then in the morning, my host insisted on interviewing me live on his radio station that is broadcast to all of Patagonia and Billings, Montana. Another time, an incredible family invited me to sleep in their guest room after just a short conversation in the town square and after cooking me lunch to eat with them. At night, they also took me on a tour of their town and showed me how truly wonderful life can be when we focus on the communities where we live and on our relationships with our friends and family. Eventually, I did make it to Buenos Aires, and luckily without getting stabbed or robbed. I really enjoyed being in a city and calling a single place home for more than a couple of days. And while there, I spent a lot of time thinking about what I wanted out of the rest of my trip. Because bike touring from town to town like I had been doing had come to feel less like a fun adventure and more like a monotonous drudgery of voluntary homelessness. So I decided that after flying to Santiago and spending time with my partner, I would skip ahead to one of the parts of my original plan that I was most looking forward to, the Peru Divide. My partner also brought me new rims and tires from the US, and I sent her home with a lot of gear and equipment I knew I wouldn't need or use. Well rested, mentally refreshed, and re-equipped, I was ready and excited for the next part of my trip. At least until starting the route and finding out that my wheels were rebuilt poorly and the mechanic who tried to help me only made it worse. I also got bad food poisoning and could barely get out of bed for anything other than running to the restroom for several days and could barely stomach food for days longer. I was homesick and miserable, and I completely lost interest in being a tourist and dealing with mechanical issues on my bicycle, and I was worried I would continue to have more problems with my wheels in even more remote places. I had also been continuing to reflect on my trip and goals, and I realized that I had already gotten everything I wanted out of my trip, but instead of it taking me 9 months and 6,000 miles, it only took me 3 months and 2,000 miles. I don't think I could ever fully express how different I feel as a person, or all the ways in which my worldview has changed, or how incredibly grateful I am to have had this opportunity and for all the amazing people who helped and supported me along the way. There is simply too much to say, and it is perhaps too personal or specific to me and my life experiences, but I have to share that I have never been so happy to be home and to be fully engaged in the life I have built with my partner and our friends and families. I feel so fortunate to have truly arrived home and to no longer dream about grand adventures in faraway places, but rather to be able to fully embrace the beauty of a simpler life. While I do still plan on more bikepacking and bike touring trips, I am far more interested in routes that are shorter and closer to home. Although I may still like to try the Peru Divide again someday, but not unless or until I can be in a mindset to be wholly excited about it and extremely confident in my gear.